name is Dr. Caravan Dam, and I'm the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at University of Maryland Global Campus. And it gives me great pleasure to launch this, our first of our webinar series, Navigating the Future, where we're going to be focusing on some of the many ways that the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting many aspects of our society. And we felt September, as it's back to school month, a really appropriate place to start would be in the field of education. And so today I'm joined by both Dr. Monica Simonsen, who is our program director for our Master of Arts in Teaching, as well as Dr. Brandie Shatto, who is our program director for our suite of educational technology programs, and both are in our graduate schools. So with that, I would like to go ahead and get us started on this conversation. And our topic today is Navigating the New Normal, Guidance for Parents in the World of Virtual Learning. And so the first question I'd actually like to ask Dr. Shatto, Brandie, what specific challenges do families face in supporting virtual learning for their children in this new era?
So undoubtedly, families are facing a multitude of challenges in the wake of COVID-19. And I think perhaps one of the greatest challenges is balancing and managing multiple responsibilities. It's really a challenge to keep kids focused on virtual school while also managing job responsibilities, either because parents are trying to work from home or because maybe they need to find childcare if they're unable to be home during the day. And at the same time, families are juggling household duties, and they may have responsibilities like caring for extended family or elderly parents. So it's a tremendous amount of responsibility that everyone is taking on right now, and it can be quite stressful. And so I think it's important to remember that families need to take care of themselves and to cut themselves some slack when they're feeling overwhelmed. And I think setting clear expectations and establishing routines can help cut down on some of the chaos. You know, similar to when your child is in school, if you create schedules for things like meals and snacks and downtime, bedtime, all of those kind of typical routines, it can really help your child prioritize their learning time during the day. But, you know, I think balancing those responsibilities, that's not the only challenges that families are facing. I recently read a survey that was put out by Canvas, which is a learning management system, and they surveyed parents about how they were managing the adjustment to learning at home. And one of the things that, you know, I found kind of surprising was that one of the difficulties they noted was learning new technologies. 44% of the parents who responded, which is, you know, close to half, reported that their children had never used distance learning technology pre-COVID. And that number was obviously higher for parents of kindergartners and children in the lower grades. So, you know, we have our parents learning all of these new tools along with their children. And I think it's important as educators that we try to support our families with some of those challenges. Another survey finding was that parents feel the expectations from schools and teachers are unclear. So I think we all need to work together to open channels of communication to make sure that, you know, we're working with each other and setting clear expectations. And I think, you know, perhaps one of the greatest challenges is that there's just a lot of uncertainty right now. You know, we're not sure when this pandemic is going to end. It may not be clear at this point, you know, when children are returning to their schools, or if you're a parent or guardian that's working from home, you know, you may not know when you're returning to work. And I think that lack of ability to be able to plan ahead can cause a lot of worry and stress. And so one of the tips that I'm going to give is just to plan 1 week at a time. That can really help you and your children focus on what you can control this week. So I think on Sunday, talk about what's going to happen during the week. What are the goals for the week, and help your child focus on those weekly milestones. And I think that, you know, despite all of these challenges that we're facing, if we all work together, we'll get through it.
Thank you. It's really insightful. It's a great way for us, I think, to start this conversation with some of the considerations. Dr. Simonson, what do you think are the most important considerations that parents need to be thinking about both the space and the time for their kids learning from home?
Sure, sure. Well, as Dr. Shatto said, this is obviously going to look different for every student. You know, for to the our best extent possible, we want to create workspaces that are conducive to learning. But it's just as it is for parents who are working from home. It's harder to do that when you aren't comfortable and there's a lot of distractions, and maybe you don't have those structures and routines in place. So it's really helpful to involve your student in creating that space and that time and those structures. You can ask them, you know, what works for you? What makes you comfortable? Are we able to create a dedicated desk or workspace? Do you prefer to sit in a comfortable chair, lay on your stomach, work at a standing desk? It could be all of the above, depending on the time of day. We also want to think about really minimizing some of those distractions, and they can be visual or auditory. So, you know, visual distractions, I know for my 12-year-old, just seeing his younger brother sort of bouncing up and down on a ball, or, you know, throwing a ball against the wall can be really distracting. And so we've actually had to adjust. We had a dedicated workspace, and now we're thinking about, you know, sort of carving out a space, a separate space, a space, you know, separate from his distracting brother. Some of those other visual distractions could be, you know, a movie poster on the wall that reminds you of something you'd rather be doing, or the same could be said for a, you know, a gaming controller or a toy that's peeking out under the bed. So our bedrooms and our offices and our living rooms are all doing double duty. And now is the time to think about, can we take some of those posters off the wall just temporarily? Can we, you know, lay a blanket over some of those toys? What can we do to really sort of to minimize those visual distractions? And then there's a ton of, you know, auditory or sound distractions. So if our workspace is next to an open window and we hear the traffic and sirens and, you know, and birds chirping, or worse, kids playing outside, that can be really distracting. And so, you know, we've seen families get really creative if they don't have a dedicated, quiet, you know, distraction-free work environment. Some families have created cleaned out closets and made workspaces in closets, or laundry rooms, or a lot of people have been buying those trifold boards that you use for science fairs and trying to create a barrier between some of those distractions. So I think that, as Dr. Shatto said, the other part about it is creating some structures and some routines to minimize the burden on families. Even though virtual learning presents us with a lot of new challenges, there's also an opportunity here to foster some self-management and, you know, independence in our students. So thinking about, as Dr. Shatto said, creating schedules and checklists. You know, we're a week or more into school for most of us. And so we have the opportunity now to say, okay, what's happening over the course of the week, and what kinds of things can my son or daughter, you know, check off on their own? One of the things that I've definitely found is that it's the management of trying to remind people when they have to log on and what they need to do that's really tricky. And so one strategy is to set some cues. So you can set alarms on timers, or, you know, kitchen timers or watches or phones. I've sort of taken it a step further this year and set an Alexa in my house to start playing music about 5 minutes before the start of the next class. And I've just found that sort of gets everybody thinking, okay, I've got 5 minutes to get started, and they don't need me, you know, reminding them of everything. So again, everybody's situation is going to be different. We absolutely, you know, need to be thinking about making sure that our kids have access to the materials that they need and a space that's going to work for them. And if it means packing a backpack full of supplies and chargers so that you can move from family home to family home, or space in the house, you know, to move away from family members and distractions, we can get really creative in doing so. But I think if we think about what works for us, and thinking about making sure that they're comfortable and that they have as few visual and auditory distractions as possible, it can go a long way to, you know, creating that conducive learning environment.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting. And I love the Alexa trick. I can see how that really also just mentally prepares kids
Hmm.
for a shift out of the whatever they're doing to back into sort of more of a learning focused, I don't know, a headspace, I guess. You know,
Hmm.
one of the things that I have been thinking is, as you both have been talking, is we've been talking a lot about that learning that's happening by kids sort of pretty solo in their own homes. But obviously, there's also been a lot of conversation about learning pods. And I think on the one hand, these could be really powerful and helpful to kids as they are trying to socialize. On the other hand, they might exacerbate some of the inequities that we're seeing crop up. So I was wondering, Dr. Simonsen, if I could just sort of follow up with you on that. What do you think about learning pods, and what are some pros about them, but also maybe what are some things to watch out for in terms of equity?
Certainly. Yeah, absolutely. I think the notion of learning pods, which for anyone that isn't familiar, has sort of started off as this notion of maybe 5 to 6 students, a small group because of social distancing, coming together, and families are in some cases hiring tutors or teachers to facilitate the learning and supervise that remote learning. If you go on any parent face group in a major city, you'll see lots of matching services and people trying to pool their resources together. But that concept has really been criticized as sort of pandemic era opportunity hoarding, right? This idea of, having a group in power, those folks that have resources, pulling them together and excluding a less a less powerful group. And so then there's that those inequities get exacerbated, as you said, Dr. Van Dam. So I think that there are absolutely ways for families to come together and to think about sharing resources in ways that support the needs of all the kids in your community. So what you want to try to do is, if you are going to share resources, if you are going to take turns having a child at your house so that your neighbor can go to work and then you flip flop, think about doing it in a way that doesn't take resources away from other kids. So stay enrolled in your public school, because most states fund districts on a per pupil revenue basis. So if you unenroll your kids from school, you're actually taking money away from the public schools. Think about who's going to do that supervision. Don't try not to hire a district teacher that's going to pull those teachers away from classrooms. And maybe think about being intentional in building your pod, thinking about ways that pod can reflect the community that you live in. Some of those matching services that I was talking about before, they've started offering scholarships. So they'll do sort of, if it's a pod of 5, 1 kid per pod has to be on a scholarship. The challenge is that's difficult to do. A lot of the pods or the learning groups that are coming together are pretty organic. They're coming together because they're friends and neighbors. And so offering a formal scholarship is difficult. I think one of the things we want to think about is that as we navigate virtual learning, especially with that uncertainty that Dr. Shatto said, if this goes on for an extended period of time, how can the rest of the community start to create structures that can support virtual learning for families beyond sort of these little organic pods? Our community, we have community groups all over Big Brothers, YMCA, that are starting to host supervising remote learning. So families can drop kids off at these community or rec centers to have access to Wi-Fi and healthy snacks. How can we support those organizations so that we can build the infrastructure in our community? I think schools need to start thinking about how can we help match families, help share resources. I know my kids' school has started a house system, so think sort of Harry Potter, where they're trying to sort of match families and have families that wouldn't ordinarily interact with each other come together to sort of brainstorm and share resources. So I think the notion of learning pods has really come out of improvisation and just necessity, right? We're all trying to do the best we can with what we have. And it's not that unlike what people have been doing for years. There are, lots of families and lots of communities that have been, helping each other out, and neighbors watching each other's kids and grandmothers watching each other's kids. But I think as a system, we need to figure out a way to make sure that we're supporting those structures and not, as you said, exasperating those inequities.
That's really powerful. And I think it was interesting as you were talking about some of the ways that inequity could creep in. Those were some really great examples. And I didn't really realize people were trying to withdraw their kids from school or hire away teachers. And definitely I can see how those would have negative impacts on the communities. So thank you for that. It was really interesting. Dr. Shatto, turning back to you, one of the things that I think has certainly become clear over the last 6 months or so is that parents are having to communicate with their schools and their teachers, their kids' teachers, in really different ways, and in this new normal. So could you talk about some of the ways that you think families can best support their kids in how they communicate with their teachers and their students' schools to help best guide and support their kids' learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best advice that I think we can give is to be proactive and to establish those lines of communication with school administrators or teachers. Don't forget about your school counselors and other personnel, and establish those lines of communication early. What I would encourage is, don't be afraid to open dialogue about what is and what isn't working for your children. This is a new endeavor for everyone involved. And I really do believe that the education community wants to work together with parents. We want to support children and meet their needs the best we can. So, open that line of communication with them. I would say, don't be afraid to reach out to your classroom teacher and find out, what are their communication preferences? Do they prefer that you email them? Do they want you to call them? Do they prefer to set up Zoom meetings? Find out what their preferences are. Ask if there are office hours that you could stop in, virtually and ask some questions. And you may even be able to set up regular check-ins. Maybe that's an option so that you can connect with them on a regular basis. I would also encourage families to take advantage of parent portals and other digital tools that might be available. I think most schools generally have some sort of parent portal that allows you to log in and check grades or see student progress and activities. So, I would check out your school's website to see, is there a parent portal? If so, how do you access it? What information can you find out? And another suggestion I have is have your child show you around his or her digital classroom. They're learning a lot right now, and letting them show you their classroom can help them continue mastery of that new technology that they're learning that I talked about earlier. And it gives them a sense of ownership with the learning they're doing. It can really change their mindset and get them excited about learning if they get to share it with you. And I think it's a great way for, parents and children to connect about the learning that they're doing. You can also take advantage of features of digital tools, like if your school is using Google Meet or Google Classroom or any of those other tools. Look to see if there's the ability to add a profile or a profile picture. Just doing those kind of things helps the teacher get to know your child, their likes, their dislikes, and it helps to start building those relationships. Another thing that I thought of as I was kind of thinking about virtual learning and the impact on families is, there are a lot of acronyms in education. We love acronyms. So if there are acronyms that you don't understand, make a list. Write down the questions that you have so that when you have those opportunities to dialogue with the school and the teacher, you can you can get those questions answered. You can understand the language, and you can use the language with your child, and it helps kind of normalize this new routine that we're all in. And I think that probably the most important advice that we can give is to try to stay positive. Remember, everyone's doing their best. We're all trying to get through this together. Be open to change and be open to things not working 100% of the time. We know technology is wonderful, but it isn't without glitches sometimes. And I think in the end, what we'll learn from this experience is how we handle the unexpected. And the things that didn't go as planned. So an open mindset and a willingness to try new things, it's a great characteristic to model and encourage in children. So ask questions, stay involved, remember to take time to recharge for both you and your kids. And I think we'll get through this together.
Thank you so much. It definitely, we're having a definite exercise in the development of resilience and grit, aren't we?
Absolutely.
So I want to thank you both and just say that, you know, as we were having some initial conversations around this webinar, it became clear that we actually had more than one webinar's worth of things to talk about. And so actually, Dr. Simonsen and Dr. Shatto are going to be back with us in a month to talk about some of the ways this is actually maybe changing the field of teaching, as well as how technology can enable education. I think we all agree that while there have been some bumps in the road, this actually has the potential to transform education and educational instruction in some positive ways. And so they'll be coming back. And if there are topics that you would like them to discuss when we're back with them in a month, please feel free to leave those in the comments. In 2 weeks, we're actually going to have a webinar where I'm going to be talking to Dr. Jim Coker, who is the chair of our sciences department. And with his background in microbiology and virology, he is going to talk to us about the state of vaccine development and some of the history of vaccines and how vaccines are going to be important as we try to move towards the future. So I hope you will also join us in a couple weeks. And these webinars are going to be happening throughout the fall and into the new year. And so also, if you have any suggested topics, please feel free to let us know those and we'll try to incorporate those. So again, Dr. Simonsen, Dr. Shatto, thank you so much. I've learned a lot and I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk about these really important issues affecting our kids and our families.